Why isn't Easter on the same day like Christmas every year? It seemed logical to me that if Jesus was born on the 25th of December, then why wouldn't his resurrection be on one specific day of the year as well? Why did the resurrection day change every year? It just didn't make sense to me. If you really want to uncover the real meaning of the two major Christian holidays of Christmas and Easter, you can fact check them in the mythology of ancient Kemet. I know that most in the West only think of mythology as folk tales and entertainment, but that's not what they were to the ancient Africans. The mythology was a way to explain science, biology, astronomy, and other aspects of nature. They're formulations about the universal laws and how to apply them in different areas of your life. Not the icons and idols that they became in Christianity, that one is to revere and worship, with little to no relevance in your life except to compare yourself and what you are lacking in relation to perfection. You can gain a wealth of knowledge when you understand the progression and evolution of the ancient Kemetic mythology and symbolic language. In this video, I'll break it down for you in a way that it will forever and consistently be Baroque. Let's start from the beginning with how the ancient Kemetic mystery systems taught the initiates about nature and universal law so that you can gain the understanding of the ancient African paradigm. Even the term nature had a broader meaning to ancient Africans. Nature included experiences that were beyond our five physical senses. For example, a dog has a keener sense of hearing than humans. They can hear a certain pitch of a dog whistle, but a human can't. Even though we can't hear it, we know there was a sound because the dog reacted to it. The sound that the dog can hear, but we cannot, is a part of nature. Because we couldn't hear the sound doesn't negate that there is a sound beyond our human abilities to experience. There's also the sound beyond a dog's ability to hear. These aspects of nature that our five senses are unable to experience are part of the ancient African paradigm. These sounds would be beyond the physical or metaphysical. There is no separation between the sounds that we can hear and the sounds that we can't within the African paradigm. This is the reason they would place animal parts on a human in their art. It was to symbolize the keener senses and abilities. The point being that there are aspects of nature that are beyond our human capabilities to experience. The way our soul perceives within us is oftentimes beyond the capabilities of our human senses. We call these abilities extrasensory perception, or ESP oftentimes. This is a glimpse into the African paradigm and their idea of nature. For them, the soul and its abilities to perceive outside of time and space is an aspect of nature. It is a metaphysical ability. These extrasensory abilities were represented in their mythology. It gives clues to the possibilities you have as an incipient god in human form. The netters of Kemet are aspects of nature that account for and include their broader paradigm of nature. The ancient Africans would say that nature is how an incomprehensible creator shows itself. In the book Sacred Science, R.A. Swallow-Delubich describes how Egyptians expressed their netters this way. These principles, or ideas which preside over forms and functions, were called netters in Pharaonic Egypt. It's unfortunate that Egyptology interprets these glyphs as meaning God. There are no gods in existence. God is. Only in nature do the divine qualities show themselves, and they exist, and the netters exist. So in Kemet, netters as an aspect of nature or universal laws were not people or function like human beings in any way. They were analogies to help an initiate understand the functions of nature beyond human volition. However, in order to help initiates understand how nature functioned, the ancient Africans would use a human aspect as an analogy to relate it to something they were familiar with. They would also use parts of animals if it was a keener sense than humans and more representative of the metaphysical concept. They were not worshiping the animals. They were giving symbolic clues for you to decipher the hidden messages based on the society's familiarity with the body part or the animal. It's the same technique many of us teachers use today. We relate a new idea to a child's previous life experience so they can grasp what the new idea is like. Within ancient African mythology, this is called anthropomorphizing. In other words, they would use ideas and characteristics within nature as analogies to approximate abstract concepts that were beyond human physical expression and our five senses. This is key to truly grasping the ancient Egyptian symbolism. The Kemetic concepts are more than 10,000 years old. And just a little side note here, because most of us have been taught that civilization is no more than 6,000 years old, according to Egyptologists. But what most people don't realize is that the reason the Egyptologists date the pyramids to around 4,000 years old is because many of the early Egyptologists were Christian. The Egyptologists accepted a literal interpretation of the Bible and that the earth was only 6,000 years old. They got their idea from a Christian archbishop from Ireland, James Ussher, who believed in a literal interpretation of the Bible and used the lineages in the Bible to determine what he thought was the beginning of the creation from Adam and Eve and the age of the earth. 6,000 years was his calculation and simply an arbitrary number that people today have accepted and never checked into why. Science, of course, disagrees with that date and estimates the Earth at over 4 billion years old. But Egyptologists never changed to this scientific idea of the Earth being 4,000 years old. So outside of religious beliefs, it's very logical that the Kemetic civilization is much older than 4,000 years. The use and expression of netters goes back over 10,000 years. The ancient Kemetic civilization is very old. There is very strong evidence from geologist Robert Schoch that the Sphinx is at least 10,000 years old and could be as old as 50,000 years. The site where the pyramids are built was used for thousands of years before any structure was built on it. That would make the development of the spiritual system much older with the scientific age of the earth and human evolution in that context. The area of the pyramids and Sphinx was on an intersection of energetic ley lines on the earth. That's why that area was used long before pyramids were ever built on it. The reason expanding the dates beyond conventional Egyptology is important is because the symbolic language for the netters evolved over many thousands of years, way more than 6,000 years. It goes back into prehistory in the Great Lakes region of Africa near the Rift Valley, where science says humankind began. The symbols most likely began over 70,000 years or more and evolved as humanity traveled up the Nile River. The symbolic language was first connected to earth science, then to astronomy, the stars, and the journey of the soul after death over thousands and thousands of years. In the Egyptian spiritual system, the older earth science symbolic language was attached to what they call the lesser mysteries, and later the same symbolic language was attached to the greater mysteries. They didn't change the words, but evolved what the symbols represent. The symbols don't have a static or fixed interpretation as so many want to assume today. They have multiple layers of meaning depending on the area of study being represented. This is why many of the netters can have so many different meanings. Depending on the level of a lesser mystery or a greater mystery, the symbols could be representing different ideas like earth science, astronomy, biology, psychology, or even quantum physics. Yes, I said quantum physics. They were way more advanced than we realize. The more we learn, the more we realize they knew. So, based on this background knowledge, let's fact check this question. How was Jesus born on December 25th as a birth date, which falls on the same day each year, but his resurrection at Easter time is on a different day each year? The answer can be found in the Egyptian mythology connected to earth science, astronomy, and eschatology. The ancient Africans understood that at the foundation of all nature is energy. They called it spirit or the Ba. They understood the first law of thermodynamics, which is energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only change forms. That means spirit, or our modern equivalent we call energy, is in a continuous process of renewal. Again, within the ancient African paradigm, there was no separation of mankind and the aspect of nature that was beyond our five human senses. In other words, that which is physical arises from the metaphysical in the African paradigm. The physical is a mirror or analogous to the metaphysical or spiritual world. From the book Light into Darkness, it said, the ancient Kemetians realized that everything in nature is a reflection of the divine, that there is no separation of the divine and nature, that certain animals exemplified the principles of netters. When the early priests, or Hamnudi, formulated the symbols for the netters, they chose animals that were the living examples of the aspects that each netter was. In other words, animals became an analogy for what we might think of as superpowers in human beings, but still natural. The ancient Africans personified the principle of perpetual renewal on a universal level as Iuseous. This function of perpetual renewal could be applied to different aspects of nature, but universally symbolized as a child. More specific to the earth is the Kemetic trinity of Osiris, Isis, and Horus, as universal representations of the idea of masculine and feminine aspects needed to create anything in the universe. Horus is the universal symbolic expression of the child aspect or perpetual renewal. The ever-coming sun, or Iuseous, was personified in nature. For example, the Nile River was important to the people of Egypt. Every year it would flood. This flood would bring food in the form of fish to the people. They would be saved from starvation. The yearly flood could be viewed as a function of Iuseous because it is ever-coming or perpetual. Iuseous is etymologically Iusa, which became Yeshua in Hebrew and later the name Jesus in English. Iuseous, as the principle of perpetual renewal, preceded the Christian idea of Jesus by at least 10,000 years. The principle was not a person. It was a universal function of nature. Iuseous continued in the greater mysteries and later eras when astronomy, astrology, and eschatology came to the forefront. Eschatology is defined as the part of theology concerned with death, judgment, and the final destiny of the soul of humankind. Iuseous in the greater mysteries will have many contributions and connections to the Bible and scriptures ascribed to Jesus in the Gospels. It's only logical that there would be connections considering the etymological link of Iuseous and Jesus. Eschatology was the ultimate development of the Kemetic spiritual system and what passed through the Gnostic Greeks into Christianity. As Christians, we were taught that getting involved with astrology was satanic. The reason they deemed it satanic was simple. You would discover the truth about the origin of Jesus. This will make sense later when we get into the reason for Christmas and Easter. As society developed in ancient Egypt, so did the spiritual system. All the mythological and natural symbols from the lesser mysteries evolved into the greater mysteries. Knowing the paradigm of how the ancient Africans thought really helps you to connect the dots. In the lesser mysteries, I talked about the function of Iuseous and the ever-coming sun in the mythology and connected it to nature and earth science with the flooding of the Nile River. The same function of ever-coming continued in the eschatology connected to the zodiac of astrology. Here's what I mean. Symbolically, the idea of Iuseous and the ever-coming Sun, or Son of God, was represented in the precession of the equinox and the zodiac signs as the sun traversed the heavens. Iuseous became the Lamb of God in the sign of Aries the ram, which later became a nickname for Jesus. A lamb is, of course, a newborn ram. This connects the symbolic idea of Iusa as the child representing perpetual renewal or always coming back. However, knowing the underlying history or the origin of the symbol connects the dots to an astrological concept. Because Iusa was the principle of perpetual renewal, ideas were ascribed to him in the Book of the Dead and other Egyptian texts that defined and personified the concept. Sayings such as, "I am Heru, the Prince of Eternity. The Witness of Eternity is my name. The persistent traveler on the highways of heaven. The everlasting one. I am Horus, who steppeth onwards through eternity without ever stopping or standing still." And of course, he was Iusa, the ever-coming Son of God. Again, the nicknames are all connected on one level to the idea of the Sun, or Son of God, that perpetually returns. So let's see how astrology plays a part in Christianity to this day on symbolic levels that most Christians don't know. So the two biggest holidays for Christians are Christmas and Easter, celebrated as the birth and resurrection of Jesus. What Christians now celebrate as two different holidays were celebrated simultaneously in ancient Egypt as death and rebirth. In ancient Kemet, it comes to the natural idea of dying and being reincarnated. Both holidays coincide with major agricultural seasons marked by the observed behavior of the sun. Again, this is another layer of the symbolic language and mythology. The story of Jesus and the crucifixion can be told through the zodiac by understanding the seasons of the year and how the sun impacts those seasons. Originally, the death and rebirth occurred in December and is based on the behavior of the sun at the winter solstice. What we know as the resurrection at Easter was marking of a spiritual consciousness in ancient Egypt. They were both about the journey of a soul into the physical body, which is the original death, and an individual gaining elevated wisdom through enlightenment or spiritual resurrection. Again, another layer or level to the symbolic language. They have different meanings depending on what you're expressing. Astrologically, a solstice is based on the sun's position at noontime relative to the horizon. An equinox is when days are equal to nights. There are two solstices, summer and winter. There are two equinoxes, spring or the vernal equinox, and fall or the autumnal equinox. At the autumnal equinox, on September 22nd in the northern hemisphere, days are equal to nights in length. This is represented by the sign of Libra and the scales. The day after the equinox, the sun begins to set lower in the sky at noontime relative to the horizon in the northern hemisphere. The ancients would say the sun is marching toward its death or falling. Even today, we call this season fall. This fall season is represented mythologically in the story about Jesus and his crucifixion. It is said in the Bible that Judas identified the Sun, or Son of God, with a kiss. Judas represented the sign of Scorpio, whose sting looked like lips. The kiss began the journey of the Son of God into the death where darkness wins over light. From the day of the autumnal equinox in September, the sun will drop a little lower at noon relative to the horizon until the winter solstice at the day of December 22nd, when the sun reaches its lowest point relative to the horizon in the northern hemisphere. The sun would rest in that position for 3 days. The ancients called this astrological aspect the metaphorical death of the sun, because it stayed at the same point at noontime for 3 days. Those 3 days were also called the tomb because the sun rested in that place or was dead. After 3 days of the sun being at the same point relative to the horizon, in the noonday sky on December 25th, the sun would begin to rise higher each day. This is the symbolic birth of the Son of God in Christianity. As Christians, we celebrated this day as a birth of Jesus. In ancient Egypt, it had a symbolic meaning of a soul being born on earth. It was also connected to ancient astrology and the tracking of the movement of the sun at winter solstice. This again is how the ancient Africans connected the same symbolic language with meaning on more than one level. In the spring, we have a change in seasons in the northern hemisphere. It's on March 20th that marks the spring or vernal equinox, when day is equal to night. Days begin to get longer than night and the start of planting time for agricultural societies. We mark it in the United States with daylight savings time. If you plant a garden or flowers, would you plant them in the winter or spring? Just like the agricultural societies, you plant them in the springtime. At this time, it's said symbolically the sun triumphs over darkness. As I stated before, in ancient times, this event had a spiritually symbolic meaning as a metaphor for becoming a Christ and a spiritual resurrection or enlightened state of being. As Christians, we saw the crosses as symbols, but never knew that they also had multiple layers of meaning, as you can see in the image above. The different crosses were marking the seasons and astrological time. From the Kemetic perspective of a soul, the physical person has become awakened to its soul self or has recognized its connection to its higher self. Becoming aware of your omnipotent aspect is a spiritual resurrection from the perspective of the Kemetic teachings. It is the spiritual rebirth. You're born again or resurrected from the death or ignorance of not knowing yourself as an eternal being of light. The enlightening of the soul is the light of the world. Do any of these ancient Kemetic ideas that were thousands of years old before Christianity sound familiar as characteristics of a certain supposed miracle of an individual? Of course they do. All these ancient metaphors for Christ were made historical in Jesus. But the ancient meanings were about the human journey of a soul, not someone who was special above all other humans that we were to revere. Astrologically speaking, it's the resurrection of the sun from death in the winter solstice. In the spring, it is the triumph of daylight becoming longer than nights. It was significant for agricultural reasons. Why wouldn't they revere these seasons in their time? Again, as seen above, the crosses all mark seasons. As Christians, you've seen the different representations of a cross and not realized its information hidden in plain sight. Philosophically speaking, the springtime is the individual that has gained the enlightenment of wisdom when they were ignorant before they became a Christ. Psychologically speaking, a person has learned something that causes a change in their behavior. This again is how the same metaphor for the sun can be looked at on different levels: agricultural, philosophical, and psychological. From a symbolic perspective, it's still relevant for humankind today. We know other nicknames for Jesus that have an underlying astrological meaning. When the sun, or Iusa, is at the strongest time of the year during the summer solstice, it's known as the lion, as it is in the sign of Leo. The ancient Africans said that the wind at the time of the year was like the hot breath of a lion. Hence, the reason a lion was picked for the sign of Leo. The Son of God, a.k.a. Jesus, became known as the Lion of Judah. The autumn equinox is the sign of Libra, the scales. The day is equal to night at this time. 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night. In modern times, we commemorate all these points of the sun still. We just call them spring, summer, fall, and winter. In our modern cities, we don't think in terms of planting season as the ancients did. In terms of myth, Christ is born after the winter solstice, and according to the Gregorian calendar, the new year begins a few days later on January 1st. But for ancient peoples, the new year began in the springtime when all would begin to bloom. Isn't that more logical than the dead of winter? In ancient Kemetic science, in order for a human to be born into the world, the soul has to die first on the cross. The cross in ancient Kemet is symbolic of the four elements needed for a soul to cross from the metaphysical into the physical world. The sun died on the 22nd of December. Christianity skips over that aspect because it will not fit into the narrative of a historical Jesus. As a flesh and blood person, there cannot be a death and a resurrection. But symbolically, you can be born as a human and then born again spiritually. As a soul, you can leave one body and then reincarnate into another. For the ancient Egyptians, this was natural. Christ was born on December 25th as an ancient meaning of the seed of transformation, of new beginnings, as the soul descended into matter. The seed of God being planted into the soil of mother or matter. The body symbolically becomes the womb in which the soul becomes enlightened or resurrected, or the tomb for the person that never awakens to know thyself as a soul. Again, two layers of meaning. As Christians, we celebrated the birth and resurrection on two different times of the year. Ancient Egyptians celebrated the birth of the old planting year, December 22nd, and the rebirth of the new planting year in the spring. It becomes a practical representation in nature and myth. When you think of it in these terms, you begin to intuitively make connections to your metaphysical experience. But going back to the beginning and the original question, have you ever wondered why Easter Sunday is a different day each year? Why wouldn't the resurrection of Jesus not be celebrated the same day as we did every December 25th according to his birth date? That's because it's again based on astrology. Easter is always on the first Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox. The resurrection and Easter is based on the movement of the sun and phases of the moon, not the resurrection of a God-man named Jesus. If you don't believe me, you can confirm when Easter occurs with an almanac, or just look it up on Google. Easter was a so-called pagan holiday commemorating the new planting season before it became the resurrection of Jesus. I would have to think that the Christian fathers living within an agricultural society would know the origin of the concept, but chose to change it to fit the historical narrative of their Jesus. So, now you know the real reason Easter became a holiday celebration and why astrology is considered satanic. It would allow you to uncover the greatest story ever told. On one level, the story within ancient Egyptian eschatology is about the journey of the soul. The story of Jesus in the Gospels on a natural level is symbolically about the journey of the sun through the zodiac. Within the eschatology is about the journey of the soul. Psychologically, Jesus and the signs of the zodiac are about the archetypal journey of a human being as he or she gains wisdom through life experience. Even if you no longer think of the Bible as a holy book, you can still find very relevant esoteric knowledge hidden in the scriptures. Esoterically speaking, the birth of Jesus on December 25th is symbolically the soul dying on the cross of matter or material to be born into the physical world. This is where Christianity switched and twisted the original teachings. Again, the material or matter or mother or the fleshly body is the womb or tomb of the soul. The resurrection is spiritual, representing a soul that becomes enlightened and connected to its higher self through the trials and tribulations of life. Those trials and tribulations of your physical life are the womb for your rebirth. The births are symbolic of the journey of a soul within every human being on the planet, not a miracle man. It's the birth or resurrection of you, the enlightened soul. Now you have knowledge of why Christmas and Easter are of such major significance on your journey as a soul beyond the Christian dogma. I've given you some knowledge, but it's only the tip of the iceberg. Will you rewire your mind to elevate from the programming? Are you in the womb ready to be enlightened and reborn? Or will this body be your tomb, trapped by the stresses of this life? Are you ready to awaken, or will you stay asleep with fear as your constant companion? The choice is always yours. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, like, and share this video with anyone that would be enlightened by it.